All right. Can you hear me okay? My mic is still cooperating. You never know with these things. Sometimes it starts there, it's working, and then it decides not to work. But if at any time my audio goes out, just let me know in the chat. I'm trying to monitor the chat. I've got two screens up here. So if you have some thoughts as we go through this introductory portion, feel free to put them in the chat. Our design today is to make this interactive. And I do want to give a foundation in this introductory presentation, and then you will have a very engaging activity in breakout groups. That's why we have the facilitators ready to go to kind of shepherd those breakout groups, and then we will return to whole group to wrap up our session today. So I just want to thank so much for the opportunity to be here and to provide the introductory presentation. And I thank Pauline for the hours that she has put into making this session a reality and really thinking through what would make it a meaningful experience for our AECT community. And I really like the fact that several divisions are collaborating on this. So it's great to see you here. And thank you very much for our group facilitators, many past and current doctoral students and other colleagues here in the field that are stepping up and helping with today. So thank you all. So the slides I provided a shortened link if you'd like to have a copy and follow along. I will put it here in the chat. I have a slide deck here, and this is again just to kind of get us all on the same foundational level so that we can then have some engaging conversations about applying UDL strategically. And I know that there'll be varying levels of prior experience, different conceptualizations of UDL coming to this. You may be new to it, you may be very, very experienced, and all are welcome. So I'm going to try to give everyone something to kind of push you to the next level or understanding, so that then you can apply it, because I want to try to meet everyone where they are. I'm Susie Gronseth. I'm at the University of Houston, and this is Designing Strategically for Diverse Learning through Universal Design for Learning. So what is UDL? I thought that we could define it pulling from the CAST definition. CAST is the organization that shepherds the UDL guidelines, the framework, the UDL IRN, which is the Implementation and Research Network. They have started this work, David Rose and colleagues, in the 90s. And so their definition is that it's a framework to improve and optimize teaching and learning for all people based on scientific insights into how humans learn. So it used to be conceptualized as a curricular framework only, but we're seeing it as a framework that's influencing policy and programmatic development as well. And so it's not just constrained to lesson planning and curricular, started out in K-12. We're seeing it being incorporated into education in a variety of contexts, from early childhood through adult learning in varied facets, health professions education, military education, corporate training, professional development, and so on. And so we're really seeing this framework as a tool that designers can use to think strategically about who our learners are and how we can design for that variability. It has that variability assumption, and that's something that it's just part of UDL. You really can't do UDL without subscribing to this assumption. Variability is a characteristic of all learners. And we incorporate multiple pathways to access, engagement, and expression. And this enables the learners to select options that best meet their needs. So it's not just about the instructor having the control of giving different options for the learners. It's more about empowering the learners with an array of options that will help them to have the flexibility to navigate the learning experience to align with their strengths and what they need to kind of circumvent any barriers or to really maximize that experience. So we have to subscribe to this assumption that there is learner variability, that there isn't a one-size-fits-all approach. And that can be a hurdle that some people have to get over, that we are not going to design one curriculum, and if it doesn't work for the learners, then they have to have all these workarounds. No, we subscribe to this assumption that variability is characteristic, and we plan for that intentionally. So this is kind of a simplified view of the Universal Design for Learning framework, the UDL framework. And it has a couple of different, I would say, terms in how it's set up. And so there's three things. There's principles. So there's 3 principles. There's guidelines. And within each principle, there are 3 guidelines to make up 9 guidelines. And then within each guideline, there are checkpoints. So what I'm showing on this slide is the UDL framework with the 3 principles and the guidelines within it. And I've kind of simplified the framework so that it's clearer on the slide. But I'm going to put, and I have this link later on in the presentation too, I'm going to put a link in the chat to the udlguidelines.cast.org. And this is the website from CAST where it's all things UDL framework related. And they have downloads for the framework in various languages and different formats. And so you can kind of look at the framework in a simplified version if you just want to see the guidelines only. If you really want to get into the details of the checkpoints, which I'll be showing, I'm going to kind of scaffold us in. They have all the details of the checkpoints. So when we get to how are we going to apply this to some curricular planning, you'll have different options for the level of detail that you can have access to. So 3 principles: provide multiple means of engagement, provide multiple means of representation, provide multiple means of action and expression. And these are associated with different networks in the brain. The affective networks are the why of learning. That's associated with expanding options for how learners are engaged. That's this first column here. The recognition networks have to do with the content, the what of learning, and that's where we expand options for representation. And strategic networks are how we do the learning, practice, show what we're learning. That's the multiple means of action and expression. So I want to just kind of show you a little bit about each of those networks. So in that engagement, the multiple means of engagement, the affective why of learning, this is where we assign emotional significance, and learners have emotional regulation. This is connected to motivation and varied ways that people might have their interests peaked and then sustained through that learning experience. It's also where we have outcome expectations. So what do they think that they are going to get out of this experience, and how that's going to integrate with prior memories and emotions and goals. So that's the affective network that we're tapping into. In recognition, this has to do with our senses: sight, sound, taste, smell, touch. It's where we kind of categorize the information into patterns to make sense of it. And those patterns help us to recognize faces, letters, words. We get information through the tone of someone's, the way verbal tone is expressed, and it's where abstract concepts come in, like how we can recognize justice or injustice. And then the how of learning, strategic, the routines, pattern-based routines, where we plan and organize as a learner, different kinds of executing the skills like writing, speaking, throwing, dancing, and then monitoring that progress throughout and making adjustments as needed. So when we look at the checkpoints in the framework, you'll kind of see some of these things come out. And I have the entire framework with the checkpoints on this slide. I would not recommend trying to look at all the checkpoints, but this is more of a global image of the framework. But I would recommend going to the UDL guidelines so that you can look at it in a closer view. But what I wanted to show you on here is that we have this horizontal dimension to the framework where we have the 3 principles. We think about how can we engage learners in varied ways, how can we represent information in varied ways, and how can we enable learners to express their learning and practice the skills throughout the experience in varied ways. So that's that horizontal orientation across the 3 principles. But there's also a vertical orientation. So here's the UDL guidelines.cas.org that I put in the chat. I'm going to skip ahead just a second. And
Dr. Gronseth, there
yes.
is a question in the chat. Would you like to hear the question now, or shall we wait until the end of the presentation?
Let's wait till the end.
Sounds good.
There we go. Okay. So I'm gonna skip ahead just a second, and then I'll come back. So in the framework, we had that horizontal orientation. I wanted to talk through this vertical orientation too. So those guidelines, they are organized in 3 levels within each of the 3 principles. At the first level, it's access. And so we can see the guidelines across the access level have to do with recruiting interest, providing options for perception, and providing options for physical action. So this is about, you see accessibility come in. I see a lot of connections with the poor, web content accessibility stuff. So that's at access. How can we engage learners to recruit their interest? How can we provide that content in accessible ways? And how can we enable learners to show what they're knowing in accessible ways? Then we get a little bit more involved in these guidelines at the build level. So this is pretty meaty at the build level. We're sustaining that effort and persistence. So we're not just trying to recruit their interest. We're in the learning experience. How can we sustain that? How can we help them to sustain that? And you see, it's really hard to see in the big picture, but in this level is where collaboration comes in, community building. Within that, how can we support that within the learning experience? Helping them return to the goals so that they can monitor and make progress toward their goals. We see at the representation principle at build level, language and symbols. So how can we clarify vocabulary? How can we illustrate through multiple media, helping promote understanding across languages? And then in that multiple means of action expression at the build level, we look at multiple media for communication, different tools that we can construct and have composition, and so on. So that's at the build level. And then we're going to get to a third level, and that's internalize. And this one's all about self-regulation. So how can we promote that self-assessment, reflection, coping skills within our learners? And we're thinking through multiple means of engagement. And you really see at this level that it's about equipping those learners. It's not so much about what's the instructor doing for the learners. It's about building that curriculum, that learning experience, such that they will be able to have the prompting, to have the routines in place, to self-regulate, to ultimately take control of their learning experience. In the representation principle at the internalized level, we're at comprehension. So how can we connect to the background knowledge that they have, patterns, transfer and generalization happens here too. And then in the multiple means of action expression, providing options for executive functioning. So helping with the goal setting, supporting planning and strategy development, managing information resources. There is some overlap, right? This is fuzzy stuff. It's not that, when I provide goals and I provide prompts to return to those goals and to reflect on those goals, that it's categorized into the access level only or the internalized level only. It's fluid. You see it happen across. So it gets to be something that is a growth process. It's iterative. And at the very bottom of the framework, you see a goal level. So what we're trying to do as designers, as instructors, we're trying to equip our learners to develop learning expertise. And so that they are purposeful, they are motivated, they're resourceful and knowledgeable. They know where to look for the resources and tools that are going to help them to be successful. And they're strategic and goal directed. So they've taken over those goals and they're applying strategies effectively to help them achieve those goals. Okay. So now I'm going to go back to a question I want to pose to you in the chat. Would you recognize UDL if you saw it? So that's a question that Dr. Dave Eddyburn posed in 2010 in his seminal article, and looking back at the first decade of UDL, looking ahead to where we needed to go as a field. And he's since written a follow-up piece in my book about where we are and what's UDL looking like in the next decade. But I pulled a couple of stock images, and I want to see if what you think. If you saw this or heard about this experience, would you characterize it as UDL? So the first option is we have a teacher who has a Kahoot game on the screen. We've got a classroom of children watching actually finishing the Kahoot game. It says game over on the screen. We assume that they were somehow engaged, although we don't see any devices in their hands. B would be an adult learning situation. It looks like a computer lab. We've got a lecturer or presenter trainer at the front of it with looks like a slide on the screen. He's got his hand extended like he's explaining. The room is watching what he's doing. They have something on their screens that they may have taken notes or maybe completed an activity. Not sure. They look like they're listening at this point. In C, we have a ramp that is right next to a stairwell in concrete. There's a wall next to the ramp. It's in the same situation. Looks like you can go from the same place to the same place, either by ramp or by stairwell. And in D, we have two children. You can see the iPad in a protective cover. One child is holding. They have their hands on the outside of the iPad. They're not touching the screen at this moment, but they're looking, mouth half open. Maybe they are having a conversation as they are conducting whatever they are doing. It looks like it might be in a classroom setting. So would you recognize UDL if you saw it? Would you say A, B, C, D? Put what you think in the chat. And we have 44 people logged in, so I'm going to give another maybe 30 seconds to kind of see about 40 pop in. So far in the chat, I'm seeing a lot of C's. I see an A, which is the teacher with the Kahoot game. Oh, here we come, some diverse answers. We've got some D's where the children are on their iPads. All right. Going once, going twice. Now we're getting a little bit deeper, saying, well, what about the context? It could be. We're not quite sure. It's hard to say if we know UDL when we see it. I will say a few reflections that in my conversations with people around the world about universal design for learning and inclusive instructional design frameworks like UDL, that there's this continuum that I've observed about our conceptualizations. On one end, I hear it being, we'll start on the right side. I have a two-sided arrow, and on the right side is a mindset, a philosophy, an ideal not yet realized. And so I hear about UDL and similar frameworks being this philosophical conceptualization. And when you do that, you really fold in a lot of different things that you could say, this is UDL. You may say, if you have that philosophical conceptualization, that something like C is universal design for learning because it's providing multiple means of access. Okay, so then on the other side of our two-sided arrow, I hear where universal design for learning is really more of this series of checkpoints, and it's for curricular design and teaching. And there's conversations around how many of these guidelines, checkpoints, do we have to include for this lesson or this course to be considered UDL? And so I hear those conversations that it gets very pragmatic. And when we do that, we might take a look at an example where we look at gamification, for instance, and say, well, we're doing this gamification because we're providing multiple means of engagement. And maybe there's multiple kinds of ways that people can input their answer. So that's multiple means of access again. And maybe, I use Kahoot in my courses, and I provide it sometimes in my asynchronous online courses as an option among many options, or I create it as an activity that students can do their own game and contribute as a way that they can express their learning. So there is some context here. This could be a game that a student created. I know my middle schooler had to create a Kahoot this past year for one of his classes. So we're not quite sure all of those kinds of details. We can't say that just a Kahoot game is UDL without kind of knowing the context. But we are talking about universal design for learning. So if the curb cut, the ramp is not facilitating learning, if we don't have some learning objectives that we're trying to achieve, then an architectural element like that wouldn't fall under the umbrella of what we're talking about here. But I have had in putting together that edited book that Pauline mentioned, I have had some really interesting conversations with some colleagues in India, and they're doing BALA, which is building as learning aid, and they're looking at physical learning spaces. And how can we embody informal learning experiences, opportunities for engagement within the environment that the learning takes place. So, in that way, the construction and the design of physical spaces could fall into this conceptualization of UDL. The main takeaway that I have is that from our conceptualization to the implementation, which is what we're going to have as part of the breakout, is that it's multi-layered, it's iterative, and it takes into account our place-based needs. So we do a lot of listening when we design through UDL. We listen to our learners, we listen to, if we're designing for an organization, working with subject matter experts, we're listening and we're trying to take into account what the needs are and how we can situate supporting a diverse learner diversity within that context. So I kind of check myself, I think, when I come to applying UDL is where might I be on that continuum? I don't feel like I'm a static, always on the right in the mindset philosophy realm or always on the left. And I operate somewhere on the continuum depending on what it is that I'm doing. If I'm having a policy conversation, then I might be subscribing more on that mindset philosophy. Like, why are we talking about inclusive education within this context and what undergirds that? Then I'm going to be talking about, that we do have learner diversity, that education is a right, and so on, and kind of drawing from that part of UDL. If we're looking at lesson planning, I might be looking specifically at checkpoints within UDL to inform how I can incorporate strategic flexibility within that context and the myriad of constraints that may be present. So I'm not saying that it's one or the other. I just present you with this continuum to kind of reflect upon where you might be, where you need to be when you are designing in that context. Ultimately, I would kind of synthesize that conversation to say, through a UDL approach, designers aim for as much eventual transfer of responsibility and control to empower learners. And this is done through anticipating barriers and expanding options within the instructional strategy. So it's much more than voice and choice, which I think some people, when they first hear about universal design for learning, they just think that it's providing options, providing a menu of options, a tic-tac-toe board of options. But it's so much more than that. It's about thinking through what potential barriers there might be present, and that can be a moving target. I mean, COVID this past year has given us a lot more food for thought as designers about what barriers and challenges our learners might be experiencing. And then trying to anticipate those and incorporating options so that there could be multiple pathways to accommodate. All right, so I'm going to skip back ahead because I had an epiphany that I wanted to do it in that order. So when we get to applying UDL, there's the 3 principles, the 9 guidelines, checkpoints galore. If we could kind of synthesize that into what the critical elements are, and if we've got some researchers who wanting to do research on UDL, Kavita Rao and a group within the UDL IRN have been doing work on this critical elements of UDL. That's the keywords you're going to want to search for. And they've identified these 4 things when we say that we're going to apply UDL. You want to have clear goals. It's very goal oriented. You want to have clear goals, intentionally plan for learner variability. You want to have flexibility in your methods and materials where you can, and timely progress monitoring. And so I've pulled this from they have a 1-pager. There's research. This is the critical elements of UDL and instruction. I've got the link here at the bottom from the UDL IRN, and then as well as you'll see materials from Rao and colleagues. But these are the 4 things that we're hearing in the field that makes it UDL. Those clear goals, intentional planning for learner variability. It's not haphazard. It's very strategic. UDL is front loaded. So it takes additional time at the beginning to think through these things, to plan for these things, and then to incorporate that flexibility. Timely progress monitoring means that you're not done. You gather data and you use that to inform and revise your instruction, which, you can hear some similarities in instructional design processes like Dick and Carey, where it's recursive and you go back and you revise your instruction, or you gather that formative assessment data to inform how you move forward and how your designs progress. All right, so designing through UDL. I wanted to create a scaffold, and this is in collaboration with our discussion facilitators. We've been meeting leading up to this session to try to brainstorm how we can have a succinct session like this to really dive into the complexity of applying UDL. And so we've come up with this scaffold of how you might go through the process of taking either a curriculum, a course, a lesson that has already been designed and you're going to redesign it through that intentionality of UDL, or maybe you have some sort of training, workshop, instruction, course that you will be designing from the ground up that you don't have a prior course for, that you would redesign. It would work for both ways, and kind of how you might get started in that. So in keeping those goals in mind, we want to discuss the key outcomes. So it's goal oriented. We have to look at what those main goals are, and we have to continue to return to that. I know when I have my designer hat on, I have to keep those objectives, the goals, the main aims that I want to accomplish right in front of me, and continue to refer back to that, because I have all these ideas of different activities and things that we could do, but do we really need to do that to achieve those main aims? And separating out from what you want to accomplish with how it can be accomplished. Are there different ways that it could be accomplished than maybe had been originally articulated in that goal statement? What is required of all learners? What's the essentials that they need to know, and what might be optional? And what aspects have potential for variability in practice and demonstration leading up to some sort of summative assessment? So kind of breaking that down and discussing through that. The second step would be to really think through the differing learner needs. So describing those target learners and how they might differ. So we've had conversations even coming into this session about who is going to attend, and then as people enrolling, where are they coming from? What are they interested in? Where putting together that pre-survey of groups, right? So that we could just kind of understand what people's priorities are going to be. And then what barriers might they have? So how could we anticipate where we may need to incorporate variability? And then the last three steps are going to be associated with the levels of the framework: access, build, and internalize. So I've got quite a bit of text on here, but I've got the three principles. So at the access level, these are kind of some reflective questions relating to how we can support access and accessibility within engagement, how we can do that within representation and action and expression. And these are, you'll see again on the handout for your breakout group. But just to kind of tell you where that comes from is from this access level. So looking at the different checkpoints, I turned those into reflective questions as a designer. Same thing for the build level. When we're building learner expertise, for instance, in the representation, how could language be supported planned for and supported, such as specific vocabulary. So you could have a conversation around that specifically and build that into your design. And that comes right from the framework. And then optimizing internalization. So again, in those 3 different principles, and you'll find ideas for that within the internalized level of the framework. So to kind of wrap it up, why design through UDL? It seems like a lot of work, a lot of extra time. Well, there is some developing research in that it not only promotes accessibility for specific learners with certain disabilities, we are finding that designing through UDL can provide more engaging and meaningful learning experiences for all learners. And during the pandemic this last year, we've learned that having options when these new challenges arise can support learners with a lot of different barriers, proactively. So it is definitely a relevant current framework. I'm going to finish with a few ideas that you might, just to kind of get your brain thinking when you get into your breakout groups. If you're going to apply at the access, build, and internalize level, you might be thinking about the different kinds of formats for the content being posted, like live presentations or recordings to some sort of class website or resource base, providing readings or videos using different tools, or incorporating links to text-to-speech software and supportive assistive technologies within the materials that can give different means of access. Having things that show students what's coming next so that they can plan and be intentional to be goal setting. Being explicit about rules, about conduct and expectations within the experience. Having scaffolds, like discussion scaffolds, activity structures, how things are going to be assessed, so that, again, students can self-regulate, plan ahead. Support graphic organizers and visualizations of content, or representing content through visuals and text, movement, and so on. And I thought this quote seemed applicable from Maya Angelou. We do the best that you can until we know better. And then when we know better, we'll do better, right? So we know that supporting this learner diversity is going to create some better outcomes. So now that we know, we do. UDL, when we apply it, is comprehensive. And this comes from a colleague, Elisa Lowry, who had a really good book just come out. If you're thinking about some criticality in UDL, critical issues in universal design for learning, Dave Eddyburn served as the publisher for this book. Elisa Lowry was the editor. And she did a session a couple weeks ago where I thought she really synthesized UDL nicely in these 4 terms: that it's comprehensive, that it's proactive, that it's intentional, and that it's iterative. So we're hearing that when people talk about UDL in some. Okay, so now we're going to break out. Hand it back over to Pauline.
Thank you, Dr. Gronseth. Yes, we're about to go to the breakout activities, and there may be some change, but it's okay because there are about 40 of you, including us, including the facilitators. But here's what I'm gonna do. We have 2 questions from Helen and from Jamie. I'm going to keep that question. Actually, I'm gonna really quick right now, and Dr. Gronseth can decide if it's something that we should answer during the Q&A session or right now. So here's the question from Helen. At the start of scoping or developing a curriculum, should an organization identify variability factors that are unique to their needs, or are variability factors predefined?
So, David Rose and colleagues would say that variability is systematic. And so we can plan for particular variabilities. Like we need to plan, we think about accessibility. We need to plan for individuals to access material using different senses, audio and video, using closed captions, providing alt text, and so on. The web content accessibility guidelines are in play, and so on. So there's some certain variability that we do need to plan for. But then I think that conversation about how else people might vary is very productive, that you can have with the organization that maybe they hadn't thought through. Who's coming, finding out what their priorities are, what do they already know about this content, what do they bring, time variabilities, language variabilities, and so on. So I think that is productive, that there are a set of predefined, but then we also have that conversation that informs our design.
Thank you, Dr. Susie. From Jamie Bernard, there is a question here. What material can I cite about the continuum, this webinar, or anything published already as well on this?
I haven't published on it. Working on an article about that. It kind of something that I came to understand this past spring, working with some colleagues in India on a workshop that we did. And so we presented on that for the Include Collaboratory in March. And I presented that continuum for the first time there. And this would be the second time. So we're working on an article right now this summer. And so I'll probably include it in that. So that would be next year. And I guess in the meantime, it would just be either the Include Collaboratory webinar or this one.
Thanks again, Dr. Gronseth. All right, so everyone, we're gonna go to the breakout and I'm gonna explain it how it's going to work. In the meantime, we're going to stop the recording because the breakout sessions, the breakout activity will not be recording. So I'm going to stop recording right now.